The first time a German infantryman truly noticed the Americans, it was not during a thunderous assault or beneath a screaming sky of artillery, but in a half-destroyed French village where the war seemed to pause for a breath. The streets were choked with rubble and damp dust, the smell of burned stone clinging to the air. And yet from behind a shattered wall came laughter, unmistakable, careless laughter. It startled him more than gunfire ever could. He had been raised on certainty that war was discipline, silence, obedience. He had been taught that Americans were loud, lazy, undisciplined boys who would crumble at the first taste of real combat. But there they were, leaning against broken door frames, helmets pushed back, sleeves rolled up, trading jokes while cleaning rifles with hands that moved from habit rather than instruction. The German soldier watched them from cover, heart pounding, and felt something unfamiliar take root inside him, doubt. Before the war, German briefings and newspapers had painted Americans as a nation softened by comfort, distracted by movies and money, incapable of enduring hardship. Officers repeated it until it sounded like fact. Yet now, after weeks of retreat and relentless pressure, the enemy in front of him did not look soft. They looked relaxed, and that was worse. Relaxation under fire was not weakness, it was confidence. One American passed a piece of chocolate to a thin child who had been watching from a doorway, then casually checked his surroundings, eyes sharp, posture alert. Another adjusted a radio set, arguing with a sergeant in a way that would have earned punishment in a German unit, yet no one shouted. Orders seemed more like conversations, suggestions weighed quickly and acted upon without ceremony. The German soldier realized with unease that this looseness did not slow them down, it made them faster. In letters sent home, German soldiers struggled to describe what they were seeing. Some tried to mock it at first, writing that the Americans were sloppy, that their uniforms were ill-fitting, that their salutes were lazy. But even as they wrote those words, the tone shifted. They mentioned how quickly American patrols appeared after an engagement, how positions thought abandoned were suddenly probed again before German units could reorganize. They wrote about the strange mix of youth and competence, of faces that looked almost cheerful until the shooting began. When the fighting started, those same men moved with terrifying purpose, spreading out, flanking, calling in fire with efficiency that felt mechanical despite their human warmth moments earlier. It was as if two different armies inhabited the same bodies, one casual and joking, the other precise and lethal. German veterans of the Eastern Front, hardened by years of brutal combat, initially dismissed the Americans as inexperienced. They said these soldiers had not known true suffering, had not endured winters that killed as surely as bullets. But even those veterans began to notice something unsettling. The Americans learned quickly. Mistakes that would have been repeated for weeks by other forces were corrected in days. Tactics adapted. Equipment changed. If something failed, it was replaced. If a unit faltered, reinforcements arrived, not just men, but fresh vehicles, ammunition, food and medical supplies. To German soldiers accustomed to scarcity, to repairing worn boots and rationing bullets, this abundance felt unreal, almost unfair. One soldier wrote bitterly that fighting Americans was like fighting a factory that walked forward on legs. Yet it wasn't just the material strength that disturbed them. It was the mindset. Americans seemed to believe, genuinely, that the war could be won, and that they themselves could survive it. German soldiers had been raised on duty and sacrifice, on the idea that death was an acceptable price for obedience. The Americans fought with a different logic. They took risks, but they expected to live through them. They dragged wounded comrades out under fire with an urgency that bordered on defiance, as if refusing to accept loss as inevitable. German observers noted this again and again. Americans would attack fiercely, pull back if necessary, and then attack again, adjusting each time, unwilling to simply bleed for ground without purpose. This practical courage confused an enemy trained to admire endurance for its own sake. There were moments of shock that spread quickly through German ranks. A unit would hold a position, convinced it had repelled an American advance, only to be hit minutes later by artillery. so precise it felt personal. Shells landed not randomly, but exactly where German soldiers had regrouped. Survivors spoke of radios crackling with calm American voices calling death down from miles away. Air support followed, fighter bombers screaming overhead, striking with an accuracy that left no illusion of chance. To Germans used to fighting with dwindling aircar, the sky itself seemed to belong to the Americans. This dominance changed perception faster than propaganda ever could. It was hard to believe in American weakness when their presence filled the earth and the air at once. Still, there were quieter observations that lingered just as strongly. German soldiers noticed how Americans treated prisoners. They expected brutality, having been warned repeatedly about the enemy's supposed cruelty. Instead, captured Germans were often given cigarettes, water, even food before being marched to the rear. Guards joked with them, sometimes clumsily, sometimes with awkward kindness. This was not universal war, never is, but it was common enough to spread by word of mouth. For men raised to believe the enemy was monstrous, this behavior was deeply unsettling. It challenged the moral certainty that sustained them through hardship. If the enemy could show mercy, what did that say about everything they had been told? Around campfires and in foxholes, German soldiers began to talk differently. They still feared American firepower, still cursed their endless supplies, but the tone shifted from contempt to wary respect. They spoke of Americans as unpredictable, not because they were chaotic, but because they were flexible. Where German doctrine emphasized rigid plans and strict execution, Americans seemed comfortable changing course mid-battle. Junior officers made decisions without waiting for approval, and those decisions were often correct. This independence, once dismissed as undisciplined, now appeared as strength. It made American units harder to anticipate and harder to trap. The German infantryman who had first watched the Americans in the village carried these thoughts with him as the front continued to move. He saw more evidence with each encounter. He saw Americans building defenses quickly, digging in with an efficiency born of both training and instinct. He saw them exhausted yet still capable of humor, morale sustained not by fear of punishment but by loyalty to each other. That, too, stood out. German cohesion was built on hierarchy and obedience. American cohesion seemed built on shared identity, on the belief that no one was expendable. It was a subtle difference, but in battle it mattered. As weeks turned into months, the initial shock faded, replaced by a heavy understanding. The Americans were not perfect soldiers. They made noise, they argued, they complained. They sometimes advanced too boldly and paid for it. But they recovered. Losses that would have shattered morale elsewhere were absorbed, replaced, and answered with renewed pressure. German soldiers began to realize that they were not facing an army that would break easily. They were facing a society at war, one that could afford mistakes and still move forward stronger than before. By the time that infantryman wrote again to his family, his words were stripped of illusion. He did not praise the Americans, but he no longer mocked them. He described them plainly, well-fed, well-equipped, confident, and relentless. He admitted, in careful language, that they were dangerous opponents not because they were superior men, but because they fought with a belief that the future belonged to them. In that belief lay their greatest strength. And as he folded the letter, listening to distant engines and the low murmur of enemy voices somewhere ahead, he understood something he could not yet say aloud. The Americans were not the enemy he had been promised. They were something far more troubling, proof that everything he had been told about them, and perhaps about the war itself, had been wrong from the very beginning. As the campaign ground on and the front lines shifted westward, German perception of the Americans hardened into something far more serious than surprise. The early curiosity and reluctant admiration gave way to a colder, more calculated assessment shaped by repeated encounters and mounting losses. What unsettled German soldiers most was not a single terrifying battle, but the accumulation of small, undeniable truths that emerged day after day. Wherever the Americans appeared, they brought with them a sense of inevitability, though the outcome had already been decided somewhere far beyond the battlefield. This feeling spread quietly through German units carried in murmured conversation and half-finished sentences growing heavier with every retreat. German officers began to write with unusual candor in their private diaries. They noted how American attacks rarely came alone. If infantry advanced, artillery followed with brutal punctuality. If defenses held, tanks appeared. If tanks stalled, engineers arrived. There was always another layer, another solution, another tool ready to be used. To German commanders, accustomed to choosing between bad options, advance without support or wait without supplies, this adaptability felt overwhelming. It was not just strength, it was resilience organized into doctrine. The Americans did not gamble everything on a single blow. They pressed, paused, adjusted, and pressed again, as if time itself worked for them. German soldiers on the line spoke often about American logistics, though few used that word. They talked instead about boots, fresh boots, on muddy ground, about warm meals arriving even after days of fighting, about trucks that seemed to materialize out of nowhere, delivering ammunition just as stocks ran low. These details mattered more than grand strategy. A soldier with dry socks and a full stomach fought differently than one scraping frost from worn leather and counting his last bullets. Germans began to feel that. They were fighting not just men, but an endless supply system that refused to break down. No matter how hard they hit, the Americans absorbed the blow and returned stronger. This abundance fed into a psychological shift the German troops struggled to articulate. American soldiers did not fight with desperation. They did not appear haunted by the sense that this battle might be their last stand. Instead, they fought as though there would always be another chance, another day, another plan. That confidence was contagious within their ranks and corrosive to German morale. Men who believed survival was possible were more willing to maneuver, to take initiative, to recover from setbacks. German soldiers, trained to endure hardship stoically, began to feel that endurance alone was no longer enough. Veterans who had fought in Poland, France, and the Soviet Union tried to reassure younger soldiers. They said all enemies seemed formidable at first, that discipline and experience would prevail, but even they could not ignore what was happening around them. American units replaced losses quickly, often with soldiers who appeared astonishingly fresh. These newcomers were not always seasoned, but they were well-trained, well-equipped, and confident in their support systems. German replacements, by contrast, arrived older, younger, or insufficient, trained, carrying the weight of a nation stretched beyond its limits. The contrast grew sharper with each engagement. Fear took on a new shape as well. It was no longer just fear of dying, but fear of being outmatched at every level. German soldiers learned to dread the sound of American artillery observers calling in fire. Unlike earlier battles, where bombardments might fall wide or arrive late, American artillery struck with unnerving accuracy. Positions thought safe were destroyed minutes after being occupied. Survivors spoke of maps that seemed to know exactly where they were hiding. This precision eroded the sense of control that soldiers clung to under fire. There was nowhere to feel truly hidden, nowhere to regroup without risk. Air power amplified this fear. German troops had once fought under skies contested or even dominated by their own aircraft. Now, American planes roamed freely, their engines a constant reminder of vulnerability. A column on the move risked annihilation from above. A supply dump discovered by reconnaissance could be destroyed within hours. Soldiers learned to freeze at the sound of distant engines pressing themselves into ditches and hedgerows, praying not to be noticed. The battlefield no longer belonged solely to those on the ground. It extended upward, and the Americans ruled that space. Yet, even as fear deepened, something else crept in, grudging respect. German soldiers recognized professionalism when they saw it. American patrols were cautious but persistent, probing defenses rather than charging blindly. When they attacked, they coordinated fire and movement with care. Mistakes were made, but they were corrected. Germans noticed how quickly Americans adapted to local conditions, learning terrain, exploiting weaknesses and avoiding predictable patterns. This adaptability made them difficult opponents, impossible to pin down in the way earlier enemies had been. There was also the matter of American soldiers themselves. German propaganda had portrayed them as undisciplined and immoral, but the reality proved more complicated. Americans joked and complained openly, something German soldiers rarely dared to do, yet this openness did not translate into disorder. Instead, it seemed to release tension, allowing units to function under extreme stress without cracking. Laughter appeared in unlikely places after battles during long marches, even under shell fire. To German eyes, this behavior seemed almost reckless, but it sustained morale in ways rigid discipline could not. Encounters with American prisoners further complicated German perceptions. Captured, Americans did not always behave as expected. Some were frightened, some angry, but many remained defiant, confident that captivity was temporary. They spoke openly about being rescued or exchanged, about the war ending in their favor. This certainty unsettled their captors. German prisoners held by Americans, meanwhile, returned with stories that spread quickly of decent treatment, of food and medical care, of guards who enforced rules but rarely acted with cruelty. These stories chipped away at the demonized image of the enemy, replacing it with something far more dangerous to morale humanity. German officers struggled to maintain ideological resolve among their men. It was easier to fight an enemy depicted as barbaric than one who behaved with restraint. As respect for American soldiers grew, belief in the righteousness of the fight weakened. This erosion did not happen overnight, but it accelerated with every encounter that contradicted official narratives. Soldiers began to question not only the enemy, but the purpose of their own sacrifices. If the Americans were not monsters, if they fought with competence and treated enemies decently, what then was this war truly about? On the battlefield, this uncertainty manifested as hesitation. German units still fought fiercely, still inflicted casualties, but the spark of confidence dimmed. Every American attack carried the implication that more would follow. Every repelled assault felt temporary. German soldiers learned to expect counterattacks, reinforcements, and renewed pressure. The sense of fighting against time, against numbers, against an entire industrial civilization weighed heavily on them. It was no longer a contest of skill alone, but of endurance on a scale Germany could no longer match. As months passed, American methods became grimly familiar. Germans learned the patterns: reconnaissance, probing attacks, artillery preparation, infantry advances supported by armor, followed by consolidation and rapid exploitation. These patterns were flexible enough to adapt, yet consistent enough to inspire dread. Even when Germans knew what was coming, they often lacked the resources to stop it. Anti-tank weapons were scarce, ammunition limited, communication lines fragile. Against an enemy that could afford redundancy, German defenses felt brittle. Despite everything, there were moments of admiration spoken in low voices. A German NCO might remark on the bravery of American medics, who ran into fire without hesitation. Another might note the stubbornness of an American platoon that refused to surrender despite heavy losses. These observations were rarely shared with officers or written in official reports, but they circulated among the ranks, shaping attitudes quietly but profoundly. Respect did not weaken resistance immediately, but it changed the emotional landscape of the war. By the later stages of the fighting, German soldiers no longer underestimated the Americans. They feared them, studied them, and prepared for them with grim seriousness. The old jokes disappeared. In their place came a sober recognition. This was an enemy who could not be intimidated or exhausted into submission. Every mile gained by the Americans felt permanent, every loss irreversible. The war, once imagined as a series of decisive battles, now appeared as a slow, unstoppable advance. For many Germans, this realization marked a turning point more significant than any single defeat. It was the moment when hope gave way to realism, when propaganda lost its power, and when the future began to look unavoidable. The Americans were no longer newcomers or curiosities. They were the dominant force on the battlefield, combining firepower, logistics, and morale into a machine that ground forward relentlessly. Facing them, German soldiers began to understand that courage and discipline, no matter how deeply ingrained, could not compensate for a world mobilized against them. And in that understanding lay a fear, deeper than death itself, the fear that the war had already been lost, and that all remaining fighting was merely the delay of an inevitable end. As the war staggered toward its final collapse, German thoughts about American soldiers settled into a tone that surprised even those who felt it most strongly. The bitterness of defeat remained, the grief for lost comrades, the exhaustion of years spent fighting across continents, but layered beneath it was a clarity that only comes when illusions are stripped away. For many Germans, the Americans were no longer a theoretical enemy shaped by slogans and speeches. They were men with faces, habits, and values that had been observed closely under the most unforgiving conditions imaginable. And it was precisely in those conditions that the Americans left their deepest impression. German soldiers who were captured late in the war offered an expected vengeance. They'd heard too much about bombed cities, about the destruction that followed the Allied advance, to believe mercy would still exist. Instead, many encountered a strange, almost disarming normalcy. They were searched, disarmed, and guarded firmly, but then offered water, food, sometimes even medical care more attentive than they themselves had known for months. Wounded Germans were treated alongside wounded Americans, triaged by severity rather than uniform. This was not kindness born of weakness, it was order, procedure, and principle. For men raised to see war as a brutal contest where compassion was a liability, this approach was deeply unsettling. Spread quickly through prisoner camps and holding areas, Germans spoke of American guards who enforced discipline but rarely humiliated their captives. They spoke of cigarettes handed out casually, of Red Cross parcels arriving with regularity, of letters being allowed through. Not all experiences were gentle. War never allows for absolutes, but the pattern was clear enough to reshape perception. The Americans, even in victory, did not seem driven by revenge. That restraint forced many Germans to confront an uncomfortable truth. The enemy they had been taught to despise did not behave as expected when power rested firmly in their hands. Among soldiers still fighting, similar realizations emerged during fleeting moments of contact. A ceasefire to collect wounded, a brief conversation shouted across a river, a shared glance between men who knew the war was ending but were still ordered to fight. Germans noticed how Americans carried themselves in these moments. There was confidence, yes, but also an eagerness for the war to end, a visible longing for home. This longing did not weaken them, it humanized them. It made clear that American soldiers were not driven by hatred but by a determination to finish the job and survive, to return to lives waiting across the ocean. German officers, especially those who survived into captivity, reflected deeply on what they had witnessed. In private conversations, many admitted that they had underestimated not just American strength, but American character. They spoke of an army that allowed individuality without sacrificing cohesion, that encouraged initiative without dissolving discipline. Junior leaders were trusted to act, and when they failed, the system absorbed the failure and corrected it. This stood in stark contrast to a command culture that punished deviation harshly and relied increasingly on fear as the war turned against Germany. As the front lines collapsed and Allied forces pushed into the heart of the Reich, German civilians encountered American soldiers directly. These encounters left impressions that echoed the experiences of the soldiers. Civilians expected brutality, looting, and cruelty. What they often encountered instead was strict discipline, clear rules, and a surprising effort to maintain order. Soldiers posted guards to prevent looting. Officers punished misconduct. Food was distributed under supervision. Again, this was not universal, but it was widespread enough to stand out sharply against expectation. For civilians raised on years of propaganda, the shock was profound. German soldiers observing these interactions felt a complex mix of emotions: shame, relief, resentment, and admiration collided within them. Some felt bitterness that the enemy showed restraint, where they themselves had been taught to show none. Others felt a quiet gratitude that their families might be spared further suffering. Many simply felt confusion. The moral landscape they had been taught to navigate no longer made sense. The Americans did not fit the role assigned to them, and that mismatch forced a re-evaluation, not just of the enemy, but of everything that had led to this moment. As captivity stretched on, time allowed reflection to deepen. In prison camps, German soldiers talked endlessly among themselves. They replayed battles, decisions, moments when the war might have turned differently. Again and again, discussions returned to the Americans. How had they managed to fight so effectively so far from home? How had they maintained morale despite losses? How had they combined overwhelming force with restraint? Answers varied, but a common conclusion emerged. American strength lay not just in weapons or numbers, but in the system behind them. A society that valued initiative, rewarded problem-solving, and believed in its own future had produced soldiers who embodied those traits under fire. Older German veterans compared the Americans to earlier enemies. They admitted that while other armies had fought fiercely, none had matched the Americans' combination of adaptability, endurance, and logistical mastery. Where others relied on bravery or ideology, the Americans relied on process. They identified problems, solved them, and moved on. This practical approach made them less romantic, perhaps, but far more effective. It also made defeat feel final. One could imagine recovering from a lost battle against an enemy driven by desperation or fanaticism. It was harder to imagine reversing momentum against an enemy driven by competence. The psychological impact of this realization lingered long after surrender. For many Germans, the memory of American soldiers became a reference point in understanding the war's outcome. They remembered how Americans fought hard but did not revel in destruction, how they enforced rules even when chaos might have excused excess, how they seemed determined to win decisively, not endlessly. These memories contrasted painfully with the devastation left behind by years of ideological warfare. In that contrast lay a quiet judgment that required no courtroom and no verdict. Years later, veterans would speak more openly. Some admitted that their respect for American soldiers had grown only after the fighting stopped. Others confessed that this respect made defeat easier to accept. Losing to an enemy perceived as honorable was less corrosive to pride than losing to one depicted as cruel. This did not erase guilt or grief, but it reshaped how the past was understood. The Americans became part of a narrative not just of loss, but of learning. What lingered most strongly was the sense that the Americans had changed the meaning of strength. Strength was no longer defined solely by iron discipline, sacrifice, or ideological purity. It included flexibility, empathy, and the ability to rebuild after destruction. German soldiers, who had once believed that mercy was weakness, now saw that restraint could coexist with power, that humanity could survive even amid total war. This realization struck deeper than any defeat in battle. In quiet moments, some Germans wondered how history might have unfolded if such values had guided their own path. These thoughts were often unspoken, heavy with regret, but they shaped post-war reflection in ways that statistics and treaties never could. The memory of American soldiers laughing in ruins, fighting with precision, offering cigarettes to defeat enemies became symbols of a different way to wage war, and perhaps a different way to live afterward. And so the war ended not just with surrender papers and occupied cities, but with an enduring imprint on the minds of those who had fought against America. Guns fell silent, uniforms were discarded, and nations rebuilt themselves from rubble. Yet the image remained: American soldiers, as they truly were, imperfect, confident, relentless, and unexpectedly humane. For many Germans, that image marked the war's final and most personal conclusion. It was the moment when hatred gave way to understanding, when fear transformed into respect, and when the realization settled in that the greatest defeat was not military but moral. In that realization, the war finally ended.